The air in the sanctuary of Grace Fellowship Bible Church is thick, not with the scent of old hymnals and floor polish, but with a palpable, unspoken tension. It's 11:15 a.m. on a crisp autumn Sunday in 2025. Outside, beyond the soaring stained glass depiction of the Good Samaritan, news alerts flash across 1,000 phones tucked into pockets and purses. ICE raids are sweeping through nearby neighborhoods, targeting the very apartment complexes where members of this congregation live, work, and worship. Inside, Pastor John Miller, a man whose resolute baritone has calmed and convicted his flock for 2 decades, falters mid-sermon. His text is from Ephesians. His theme is the unity of the body of Christ, but the words feel hollow, clashing violently with the reality unfolding just miles away. He sees it in the pews. He sees Maria, who runs a cleaning service with her cousins, her eyes wide with a fear that has nothing to do with eternal damnation. He sees Officer Davis, a deacon and a local police officer, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the American flag standing beside the pulpit. This isn't just another Sunday. It's what activists and worried congregants have begun to call Deportation Sunday, a moment of reckoning that is forcing evangelical churches across the nation to confront a profound moral schism. For decades, American evangelicalism has been portrayed, and often acted, as a monolithic force, a reliable voting bloc bound by shared social values and theological certainties. Its leaders spoke with a unified voice on issues from abortion to religious freedom, wielding immense political influence. Yet, the aggressive immigration enforcement policies of the mid-2020s have acted as a solvent on this hardened foundation, revealing deep fissures that were always there, just beneath the surface. The crisis is not just political, it is deeply, painfully theological. It pits neighbor against neighbor, not in the abstract, but in the pews. The small business owner who relies on immigrant labor sits next to the patriot who believes in unbreachable borders. The new convert, a refugee from Honduras who found Jesus in this very church, now fears the deacon who wears a badge. This internal conflict is forcing a re-examination of what it means to be an evangelical in 21st century America. Is the primary duty to God and neighbor, or to God and country? And what happens when the demands of those two allegiances appear to be in direct opposition? This is not a theoretical debate confined to seminaries. It is a live crisis playing out in real time, in potlucks and prayer meetings, in hushed parking lot conversations, and anguished late-night calls to the pastor. The historical context of this moment is crucial. The fusion of conservative evangelical faith with a specific brand of American nationalism is a relatively recent phenomenon, solidifying in the late 20th century with the rise of the religious right. This movement successfully mobilized millions of voters by framing political issues in stark moral terms. It taught a generation that to be a good Christian was to be a good, law-abiding citizen who supported a strong, ordered nation. This worldview, articulated from countless pulpits, became deeply ingrained in the evangelical identity. But now, the enforcement of immigration law has become so visceral, so immediate, that it challenges the very fabric of that identity. When the stranger Jesus spoke of is not an abstract concept, but the woman who volunteers in the church nursery, the equation changes. Pastor Miller looks out at his congregation, a sea of conflicted faces. His prepared sermon on spiritual unity seems like a cruel joke. The real issue is a more terrestrial and more terrifying kind of division. The question hanging heavy in the air, thick as incense, is no longer theoretical. How will he, and thousands of pastors like him, navigate the violent collision of state power and spiritual conviction? What scriptures will they possibly lean on to guide their fractured, frightened flocks through the storm? Building on the palpable tension in those Sunday services, we move from the public pulpit to the private study, where the core theological battle is being waged. In quiet, book-lined offices and on heated, anonymous online forums, evangelical scholars, pastors, and laypeople are wrestling with two powerful, seemingly contradictory biblical mandates. This is the intellectual and spiritual heart of the Deportation Sunday crisis. On one side of the desk lies a well-worn Bible, open to the 13th chapter of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans. One faction within evangelicalism champions this text with unwavering conviction. Romans 13, which calls for submission to governing authorities, is presented as the final word on the matter. "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities," they quote, "for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." For these believers, the argument is straightforward, a matter of divine and civil order. ICE agents are part of the governing authority, instituted by God to enforce the law. To obstruct them, to shelter the undocumented, is not just to break a secular law, but to rebel against God's ordained structure for society. This interpretation, rooted in a particular reading of Reformation theology, sees national sovereignty and the rule of law as extensions of a divinely sanctioned order. A secure border is a sign of a healthy, ordered nation, and the church's role is to support that order, to pray for its leaders, and to encourage congregants, regardless of their status, to comply. Yet, on the other side of the desk, another Bible lies open, its pages turned to the Gospel of Matthew. A growing vocal chorus within the movement counters Romans 13 with the stark, challenging words of Jesus himself in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Here, Jesus describes the final judgment not as a test of doctrinal purity, but of practical compassion. The righteous, the sheep, are those who fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and cared for the sick. And, most pointedly for this debate, Jesus declares, "I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." This camp argues for a radical, Christ-centered hospitality that transcends national law. They see the undocumented immigrant not as an illegal alien, but as the stranger Jesus commands them to welcome, as a modern-day sojourner deserving of grace and sanctuary. For them, Matthew 25 is not a gentle suggestion, but the very metric of salvation. To turn away the stranger, to cooperate with their deportation, is to turn away Christ himself. This perspective often draws on the Old Testament's repeated commands to care for the dashir, the foreigner or resident alien, reminding followers that the people of Israel were themselves strangers in the land of Egypt. This scriptural collision is not new in the history of Christianity. It was debated by theologians resisting Nazi Germany and by American abolitionists challenging the Fugitive Slave Act. But the urgency of 2025's Deportation Sunday amplifies its stakes to an unbearable degree. The debate is no longer academic. It has become the dividing line. Theologians like Dr. Alistair Finch of the Westminster Theological Collective argue Romans 13 provides the default position for the Christian's relationship to the state. We are to be peaceable, law-abiding citizens. Only in the rare instance that the state commands us to directly violate God's law, for instance, to stop preaching the gospel, are we permitted to disobey. But in response, figures like Reverend Dr. Sophia Reyes of the New Evangelical Coalition for Justice contend to read Romans 13 without the lens of Matthew 25 is to create a cold, heartless civic religion. The law of the land is not God's highest law. The highest law is the law of love, the command to care for the least of these. And a family facing deportation is, by any definition, among the least of these. Are these two foundational scriptural directives truly irreconcilable? Has the American Evangelical Church created a false dichotomy, forcing a choice between two truths that are meant to exist in tension? Or has it historically found ways to bridge the gap between its civic duties and its radical call to grace? Extending our exploration from the theological battleground, we uncover a fascinating, often deliberately overlooked, dimension of evangelical history, its deep and powerful roots in social justice. The moment of discovery often happens not in a flash of insight, but in the quiet dust of an archive. A young seminary student, wrestling with the Romans 13 and Matthew 25 dilemma, pulls a box of 19th century pamphlets. Inside, she finds not pious platitudes about submission, but fiery, biblically saturated arguments against the institution of slavery. While the law and order narrative often dominates contemporary discourse about evangelicalism, These archival records reveal a potent heritage of activism that saw challenging unjust laws as a spiritual mandate. The British abolitionist movement, for example, was overwhelmingly an evangelical enterprise. Figures like William Wilberforce were driven by a profound faith that saw slavery as a national sin, an affront to God's creation. They didn't simply pray, they organized, they lobbied, and they used their faith as a battering ram against the legal and economic structures of their day. In America, the Second Great Awakening fueled a similar fire. Evangelists like Charles Finney preached that personal conversion must lead to social reform, inspiring a generation of activists who founded abolitionist movements and championed the rights of the oppressed. They directly defied the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law, by operating the Underground Railroad, viewing their submission to God's higher law of human dignity as paramount. This legacy did not die in the 19th century. It flows directly into the Civil Rights era, particularly through the prophetic tradition of the Black Church, a community that is, in its theology, deeply evangelical. Leaders like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. masterfully wove together biblical imperatives for justice with a strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience, explicitly challenging the unjust laws of segregation. They, too, were told by more conservative white evangelicals to obey the authorities, to be patient, to stop causing trouble. But their faith compelled them to see that the governing authorities of their day were upholding a system that violated the very core of the gospel message, that all people are created equal in the image of God. This historical thread reveals that the current Matthew 25 camp is not inventing a new progressive form of evangelicalism. Instead, they are reclaiming one of its oldest and most powerful identities. Today, this reclamation is happening in real time. A new generation of evangelical leaders, often younger, more ethnically diverse, and less tied to the political machinery of the old religious right, are at the forefront. They organize and support the sanctuary church movement, turning their fellowship halls into safe havens for families facing deportation. They run legal aid clinics in their basements, connecting immigrants with pro bono lawyers. They lobby lawmakers not for partisan gain, but for compassionate and just immigration reform, arguing from a position of faith. Groups like the New Evangelical Coalition for Justice and Pastors for Social Action are creating networks of support, sharing resources and theological frameworks that empower churches to act. They argue that true biblical faith is not a passive acceptance of the status quo, but an active solidarity with the vulnerable, even and especially when it means challenging the state. This re-engagement with their own progressive, justice-oriented past forces a critical question upon the entire movement. Is this reclamation a fringe development, or is it the first sign of a fundamental realignment? The schism created by Deportation Sunday is more than a political disagreement. It is a battle for the very soul of American evangelicalism, a crisis that will permanently redefine its identity and its witness in the world. The faith is being reforged, not in the halls of power, but in the crucible of compassion, one act of sanctuary at a time.